How's it going, everyone? Today I am working on a very special piece for Mother's Day, and this will be the starting point, a beautiful hollow maple cookie or biscuit if you're from the UK. It's in very rough shape, as you can see. Before I've even surfaced the top, you can already see all of the patterns and the natural spalting coming through, which actually makes the bark come off a little bit easier as well. Now, I know that one piece came off by hand, but I brought out the chisels and the hammers. I'm going to be going throughout the whole thing, piece by piece, making sure to take everything off little by little. It's a little tedious, it can take a little bit of time, but it's honestly so satisfying. And as you just saw, that one piece went flying across the garage. I was not expecting it. I even paused for a second. I put a lot of force and it just came off a little bit easier than expected. It happens. The rest of it was pretty standard, though it took a little bit of time, as I mentioned. And there was even this one piece in the middle that I attacked before I even finished the rest of the outside. It was just a very big piece and it looked kind of juicy. I don't know. I just wanted to take it off. And as you can see, it was a juicy piece. Look at how big it is. Before I do any more cleanup, I want to make sure that at least one side of the maple is flattened. Not only does that make it easier to clean up after, as it won't be wobbling around, but I have to have one side flat anyway, as I want to fill the inside of the cookie with epoxy, and I'll need that flat surface to actually bond with the mold and for the epoxy not to escape through any holes or gaps. So I got the bottom stable using some of its own bark. I don't want it wobbling around when I start to flatten the top. Now, these flattening jigs I had from other previous projects. They're not the best. They're made from plywood and MDF, and the new flattening bit I got unfortunately does not fit through the jigs. It's just too small. It's like not even half an inch long, and because of that I'll have to use my old flattening bit, which I don't even think is a true flattening bit, and it's a little crooked, as you can see. But either way, we need to get this thing flattened, so we move on. No big deal. Now, the jigs that I had, obviously the feet are too small, so I got a piece of 2x4, thought that that would work, and it kind of did. I'm measuring it out, I'm going to cut it down and go from there. Now, a 2x4 is going to be extremely rough, so I'm going to flatten one side to get it kind of smooth. I am going to be using it for a flattening bit, so I'm going to be going back and forth. Don't want any jagged edges that's going to trip up the jig. And then I'm just going to flatten the other side on the table saw to make sure I have two true flat sides. Now, to cut the feet to length, I kind of forgot how much I needed, so I went to measure really quickly, and yep, that's about right. Perfect, exact measurement. So cut that leg and then measure the second one. Perfect. These are exact measurements you want to be using in the shop. Measure twice, cut once, so you don't want any mistakes when you're cutting these precise measurements. That's why I measured that way. And there you have it. Two perfectly exact flat leg extensions for an even better jig that I made. So we're going to put those legs on. We're going to kind of test fit them out to make sure that it's so smooth. It's perfect. Now, I looked everywhere for my super glue and I just could not find it. Maybe someone stole it, whatever. So I just decided to use some tape and sharp scissors to put these on. I mean, these kind of tapes, they build houses with them, so I'm pretty sure it's fine to put a couple pieces of wood together. And after using multiple pieces and doing some vigorous testing, it was perfect. It worked way better than I expected, and we're ready to go with some flattening. Now, at this point, I realized my fatal mistake. I had made a jig that was static, and everyone knows a jig that's on bags is so much better. There's no adjustability with the jig that I just made. As I flattened the piece of maple, I would need to lower the jig to be able to flatten it further and further. So what was I supposed to do at this point? I had just spent so much time putting on these pieces of tape so beautifully. Am I just going to take it apart and put it back together every single time I want to go lower? Absolutely not. I'm going to take the whole thing to the jointer and take pieces off bit by bit to the fitment that I need. Adjustability, made my way, whatever. Now, one thing you'll notice in the video here that I didn't notice while I was doing this is because it's so heavy, it's pulling on one side and it's actually putting a camber on the piece of wood here, putting an angle on it. We don't really want that. We just spent so much time making him flat edge, and we're just taking all of that away right now. And I'm going to be confused as to why it's all wobbly now, but that's why it was wobbly. But it kind of worked. It started to take pieces of the wood off and started to flatten it, and I was pretty happy. It worked pretty well. I kept going back and forth with the jointer and the router, flattening piece by piece, and as you can see, the design on this maple was amazing. The spalting, everything was coming through. Eventually I got the whole thing flattened after some fighting with all of the different methods I had going on at once, and it looked beautiful. I really like this piece. Now once one side was flat, I could work on it a lot easier. Got the sanding pads out, 80 grit, nothing too exciting. Went around the entire piece with 80 grit and sand off any brown bits to make sure I got to the actual maple. And you could really see even on the bark and the outer side of the maple, all the design elements were still coming through when all of that bark was gone. And now the inside was a little bit more difficult. Obviously the orbital sander is not the right tool for this, but I thought I'd give it a try anyway. It's just too big. You need something like a wire wheel or something like that to kind of get into those nooks and crannies, and that's exactly what I switched to. Even though the wire wheel is not the best one that I have personally, it still did the job. I got most of the pieces out and kind of roughed up the edges for the epoxy to really bond to as well. Now we're getting to the really good stuff, the epoxy. I had this piece of MDF that I'm just covering with that same tape that I used earlier, except this is blue and that was red, and I can't really make a mold for it since it's such an irregular shape, so I'm actually going to use the piece itself as the mold. The tape actually acts as a quick release, so the epoxy doesn't stick to it and it doesn't stick to the MDF as well, and it can actually be reused later on as well. Now what I meant by using the actual piece as the mold is exactly that. I'm going to put a bead of caulking around the entire edge of the bottom side, the side that I flattened, and then I'm just going to plop it down on the tape, and it's hopefully going to seal the entire underside of the piece, and the epoxy won't be able to escape out of that. Now I kind of missed putting it down. It went off the edge on the back side there, so I had to move it a bit, which made me worried that the underside caulking wasn't bonded, so I went around the entire side again with more caulking. I'm really worried that the epoxy is going to leak, especially in this case when we're using a lot of it. We don't want the epoxy to leak and kind of be wasted that way. It's just really a waste, right? So I'm using a high quality 2-part resin, and I always like to use a scale to mix it. I found that I've had better results when I do it this way. I don't really like mixing it with the numbers and the stuff on the side of the measuring cups. When I have a specific volume that I want, I just can do it a lot easier. And this is the color that we're going with. Because it's a lake, we're going with blue for water. But it's not just any blue, it's kind of like a color shifting, almost translucent, but it's not, really weird blue that I really like actually. And this is the first time I'm using it on its own in a big project, so I'll see how it turns out. You can see all of the darker streaks and the green and blue in there, so I think it'll turn out really well for this project. Now off camera, I did let it sit for about 30 minutes after mixing for all the bubbles to kind of escape and have a clearer mixture. And here I am pouring it in the mold. It looks absolutely beautiful. And then here I am just going along the sides of the piece to make sure that if there's any weird bubbles or gaps that didn't really get filled are taken care of as well. And we're just going to let this sit for about 4 days. Now, I kind of thought that a maple lake serving tray slash presentation tray was a little too plain, so I thought I'd try my hand at carving. Now, I want to preface this by saying that I have never carved anything before in my entire life, and I decided to do it with this Kutzall wheel thing that I see a lot of people use, and it is absolutely terrifying. I believe you're supposed to have like a table vise or something like that to hold it. I don't have that, so I'm just using this to hold this piece of maple that I have, and I'm gonna try and carve a tree trunk. I thought that would add a nice design element. You know, you have a lake and a tree trunk that's kind of worn out, and a fallen tree would kind of look pretty nice next to the lake. As you can see, I decided to keep the guard on this thing because it was absolutely terrifying using it. It was spinning at Mach 5, and there was like 1,000 needles, blade things on there, and it was eating through this piece of maple. But honestly, it was so fun using this disc to carve a piece of material. I had never done anything like this before, like I said, and the fear wore off pretty quick. Once I got a handle on it, you just have to make sure to have a good grip because it can pull to one side really easily. And I realized pretty quickly as well that I could not work with that guard on there. I took it off. It was much easier to just have that wheel on there on its own. You could do a lot more maneuvering that way. After I got that guard off, I went straight for the crack. I wanted to open that up and get as much material out of the way to make that tree look like it was rotten and fallen and kind of worn out that way. And this is one of the most dangerous parts of the carving, I would say, because it's going deep in there and it can grab from both sides, and I don't want it to be grabbing that way because it can pull and kick, and like it really hurt my hand. As you can see on the bottom there, it's right next to it. It did kind of pull a couple of times, but I had a pretty good grip on it, and it was perfectly fine. Now, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get that saw cut out of there. I even tried the wire wheel. It just kind of cleaned it up a bit. The wheel would just not reach all the way in there. So what are you supposed to do? Fire. That's what you're supposed to do. If anything ever goes wrong and it's just not working, you just set it on fire. Fire fixes all mistakes. It wouldn't reach there, but what does reach? Fire. It will reach all mistakes. It will reach all imperfections. Just burn it away, and no one will ever know that it existed because it's literally up in flames. After it was burnt to a crisp, make sure to put it out so it was easier to handle, and then use this piece of stick that I found laying around to take away all those saw marks. And I gotta say, it worked really, really well. I was not expecting it to work that well, and I went over it with some sandpaper as well to take away all those charred marks, and honestly, it worked exactly how I wanted it to. Now, off camera, it did grab once and it threw it against the wall, but this is kind of the progress I made with all the carving. I put some details in there, and I decided to use the wire wheel to add some extra details as well. I'm going really, really deep on the outside of it to give it the look of actual bark on the tree, I guess you could say. Here's one side that I completed and the other side that's just plain. It really adds a lot of depth to it and makes it look a lot more realistic, I believe. And of course, to add an extra layer of realisticity, I added some fire as well. Alright, it's been 4 days and we're back to the maple piece, taking away some of the caulking to clean it up while I'm here and make it easier to get away from the table as well. Thankfully, the seal worked beautifully. I had no issues with the epoxy leaking, and it hardened really, really well and cured perfectly. Because of the little bit of time that I took to prepare the surface with the tape and the caulking that I put underneath, it was actually really easy to take this apart. Just one little tap and pull and it was good to go. And you can see that the epoxy actually did seep in all underneath, but that bead of caulking blocked everything perfectly. Now, the plan was to take away as much material as possible with the wheel and get up to the epoxy level and then go the rest of the way with the router. Unfortunately, that didn't really work out because I was going over end grain and it was a lot of material. And again, I was using a battery powered grinder. The batteries kept dying every few minutes. I don't know why. Maybe they were overheating. And all it was really doing is creating a lot of dust and not taking away as much material as I originally thought. And to make matters worse, my vacuum completely died. I have no idea why, so I couldn't even clean up any of the dust. So back to the router we go. I really didn't want to do this. You can see that outlined line that I measured where I kind of have to go down to that point. Spoiler alert, I have to go a lot lower than that because I didn't measure the epoxy correctly, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. Now this is the point where I started to lose my mind. My router would not stay at the highest speed and I still had another 0.75 inches to go. The router kept jamming up on the jig because it's made out of construction grade plywood, so it wouldn't slide smoothly. And the router is just a palm router. It's not meant to be taking off this much material, so it was getting so hot in my hand that it was literally burning me. But eventually I did get through it after hours and hours of flattening. And this is exactly what I meant by I didn't fill the epoxy to the appropriate levels. Look how thin the final piece is going to be. And it's not even flat. After all that, it's not even fully flat. It could have had something to do with the amazing flattening jig that I built with the pieces of tape and 2x4. We'll never really know, but here I am taking it apart to go back to the original build of the jig, which was the best built ever. And I'm just gonna take away one final layer to make sure it's fully flat and then just kind of go from there. Once I got it fully flattened, I sanded with 80 to take out all of those lines. This is what it looked like. I noticed there's a lot of tear outs with the epoxy as well, so I cleaned those up with some rubbing alcohol. Once the piece is fully sanded and finished, these tear outs in the epoxy are really going to come through. I don't want that, so I'm going to fill them in with some glue and put some activator on there to make sure that they're fully hardened, and then I'm going to hit them with some 80 grit to bring them back down to the surface. It's as if they were never torn out. Honestly, it worked pretty well. Not 100% perfect, but what are you going to do? And after all the tear outs were fixed, I made sure to sand all the way up to 150 because that's what we need for our finish. Before I apply any type of finish, doesn't matter what type of finish or what the project is, I make sure to clean the entire piece. There's going to be a lot of dust embedded in there, so whether you use alcohol or mineral spirits, you always got to make sure you clean the piece before you apply the finish. Now, I didn't really put any cutouts for handles because I wanted to put in these rubber feet. I think it's going to make it look a little bit better and elevate it off of the surface. And because it's a heavier piece as well, I don't want it to scratch whatever surface that is going to be put on, hence the rubber feet. I played with the layout a little bit. I don't want to put them too far apart because then it may bow in the middle over time. And I drilled the holes. Definitely didn't want to go all the way through after all the hard work to get it to this point, so I made sure to use some tape to gauge how far to go through. And here we are with our finish, the tried and true Rubio Monaco. I love this finish. Honestly, it's gonna look amazing on this piece, and once it's fully cured and hardened, it's gonna be water resistant sort of, and it's going to be scratch resistant again sort of. But as soon as that finish is applied, that lake comes to life and all the grains and the patterns in the wood really pop out. This piece, oh my god, I did not think it was going to turn out well, especially since it went a lot thinner than I thought. But now that the finish is on there and I'm wiping it away, this is when it kind of came together for me and I really started to like it. So once this bottom side was fully wiped away, I put the legs back on and flipped it over. Now, once it was flipped over, the first thing I had to do was attach the tree. Because I was still working on it, I had to make sure it stayed in place. So I used a combination of wood glue and super glue. Use a criminal amount of activator, place it down carefully, and honestly, it worked amazingly. Like, it stayed put. This is the first time I kind of used this method, testing it out there, and yeah, it was perfect and I was good to go for the rest of the finish. Mix a bunch more Rubio Monaco. I know they say a little goes a long way, but this is end grain, so it's going to soak up a lot of this. That's what I noticed when I did the backside of it. So I went double the amount that I used on the backside, and I actually ended up doing it twice. So I used quadruple the amount of the backside. And of course, the most satisfying part of the whole thing, spreading it around, the top side looks even better than the bottom. That lake and that pigment in the epoxy, it honestly looks alive. When you look at it in person, the camera doesn't do it justice, but when you're looking at it from different angles, the lake honestly looks like it's moving. And that's my favorite feature of the whole piece. The fact that the lake looks like it's moving and like a real lake. I don't know how to explain it, but yeah, it turned out pretty well, even with all the issues that I had along the way. And can't forget the tree. Have to apply some finish to that as well. I mean, you tell me a different way to do it, okay? Like, there's no other way. I had to apply it that way. I had to. Waited a few minutes for everything to seep in and dry, and wiped it all away, and we are finished. Fully completed. This is the final result. I hope you enjoyed. If you're interested in anything else, please subscribe, and we will be putting out a lot more content soon.